And before we get going into our program tonight, I would hope that all of you would take just a brief moment of silence, a bit of a prayer for the nearly 3,000 people who died on 9/11/2001. A tragedy will never be forgotten, and it changed us, probably forever. In a moment, Dr. Judy Wood will join us with her thoughts, her theory on what happened on that day. Regardless of your belief system in what took down those buildings and how those planes crashed into the buildings, remember this: nearly 3,000 people died tragically, jumping from buildings, dying in the rubble. Firemen, policemen, responders, people working in the office buildings. Show them at least how much you care about their life. And just take a brief moment, a brief prayer for that, if you would do that. Well, in a moment, Dr. Judy Wood joins us. Her book, Where Did the Towers Go?, will be talking about her thoughts on 9/11. Hard to believe, folks, it's been 13 years since that tragic day. 13 years. Where does the time go? But look how this planet has changed. Up next, Dr. Judy Wood on Coast to Coast Day. Welcome back to Coast to Coast. I'm George Norrie. As I was mentioning, 13 years ago, of course, we saw and witnessed perhaps one of our most tragic events in our lifetime. Maybe the most tragic event we will ever see, but maybe not. Dr. Judy Wood, former professor of mechanical engineering, she has research expertise in experimental stress analysis, structural mechanics, materials characterization, and materials engineering science. Now, in the time since 9/11, she has applied her expertise to a forensic study of more than 40,000 images, hundreds of video clips, and a large volume of witness testimony pertaining to the destruction of the World Trade Center complex. Her work, Where Did the Towers Go? Judy was on with me about 3 years ago, and here she is back on Coast to Coast on this ominous day. Judy, it's a pleasure to have you back.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
In the 3 years or so that we last had you on, have you seen any new evidence, or has anything changed to either continue to back up your theory or to change your mind?
It's not a theory. I deal with evidence. And as I say, if you don't have enough evidence to solve a problem, you can't solve it. You don't have enough evidence. And you don't replace what you don't have with guesses and theories and speculation, because then you're solving an imaginary problem, not the real problem. And you can't solve the real problem if you don't have enough evidence. And so you can, but what evidence you do have, you can go within that, and that's what I've done. And after you collect the evidence and evaluate the evidence to determine what happened, then you go to defining what the destructive mechanism was. And in doing that, you can eliminate the impossible and then retain what's left. It's like you start out with this big circle around everything, and then you can toss stuff out of the circle that is impossible.
Judy, in your work, Where Did the Towers Go? Evidence of directed free energy technology on 9/11. I want you to, for those who, one, didn't hear you with me 3 years ago and are brand new to the program, tell us about this and about your work, and then we'll get into the interview.
Okay. What I did is look at all of the evidence, and starting at the beginning, the issue of how fast the building went away. I don't say collapse. It didn't collapse. It went away. It turned to dust and,
pulverized, basically.
And also, it didn't burn up. It didn't slam to the ground, but most of it turned into dust in midair. I know that sounds strange, but you look at the evidence, and that's what you see. All of Manhattan was covered in, ankle-deep dust. And went down the eastern seaboard, went up and away. How do we know that it didn't slam to the ground? Well, the seismic chart doesn't reflect that. There's no S or P wave. Those are the seismic signals that travel through the Earth.
And they should have registered something. Okay.
Yeah, it's like hitting a rock with a hammer. It's like hitting a tuning fork. It should ring. Didn't. There was no detectable S or P waves for any of the 5 events. The North Tower got a hold, South Tower got a hold. South Tower went away, North Tower went away, then Building 7 went away. For all those 5 events, there was no SRP waves, but in regular controlled demolition, you get S waves and P waves and surface waves. Not only that, they calculate the seismic signal, the equivalent Richter scale reading, based on the surface wave. And even the surface waves were so weak that it was equal or less than when they blew up the Seattle King Dome. That was a 2.3 on the Richter scale. The North Tower was a 2.3 and the South Tower was a 2.1. And it should have been a lot more than that. It was equivalent to the bottom 18 or 20 stories of building.
And there wasn't any, and Judy, there wasn't any concrete, mass concrete from all those levels. It should have been all over the place. Concrete should have been in huge heaps. It was all dust, as you said.
Oh, and not just the concrete, but everything. File cabinets, chairs, desks, toilets. Toilets are easy to see, like at a junkyard, remnants of toilets. Shiny porcelain surfaces. There wasn't even one recognizable part of one. And there should have been over 3,000.
And I want to point out, by the way, every time we do programs on this, we do get some emails from some people who feel somewhat offended. They feel as if, we're not being patriotic because we're questioning the official version. I want to say this right now. It is healthy to be skeptic. It is healthy to investigate. And I think you really never can take the official version, which is, could be the John F. Kennedy assassination with the Warren report, or this report of the 9/11 Commission. You just can't take it at face value. You have to investigate. And, Judy, what was it that you saw that got you to start looking at it and coming up with the conclusions that you came up with?
Well, on that day, we were told this is a collapse. And I grew up without a TV set, and I'm not used to listening to a TV. And if the TV is telling me something that conflicts with what I'm seeing, I just shut off my ears. And what I saw was a building turning into dust in midair, sort of like a bubbler drinking fountain. And it wasn't a building collapsing. And this is bizarre, but the grown-ups will take care of it. They'll look into it. I have my job to do. It was, that mentality. But it came clear over the next year or two that nobody was looking into it. The grown-ups weren't going to fix it. Whose job was it to look into it? Not only that, I was thinking very much of the people who died there, and especially the people hanging outside the building from the 105th floor.
Oh, my God, yeah.
I felt like we owe it to them to find out what happened. And I sort of made them a promise that I would find out what happened and tell their story.
Judy, I had Richard Gage on several days ago. Richard Gage, of course, from the 2000 Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. He doesn't agree with your conclusions. And I find this important and fascinating. Both of you, of course, don't agree with the official version of what happened that day. But he doesn't believe that a free energy device or technology took those buildings. So react to that.
Yeah, I don't start with the answer and work backwards. I start with the evidence and then looking at the destructive mechanism. The towers didn't burn up and they didn't slam to the ground, but mostly turned into dust in midair. We know that because the seismic signal was inappropriate for buildings slamming to the ground. Also, the towers were built in this bathtub. It's kind of like a dike that kept out the Hudson River because they were built on bedrock 70, that's 7 times 10, 70 feet below the water table. And if you had 2 500,000-ton buildings slamming to the ground, you would have ruptured the bathtub. Didn't happen. Also, if they slammed to the ground, you see a pile of stuff left over. And actually, when I first started publicly talking about this, I was heavily ridiculed and laughed at. She says that the buildings turned to dust. Isn't that funny? No, all the rubble's there. None of it turned into dust in midair. But that's changing because I've been driving this for quite a while. So if you look at that, already we can tell that, let's look at types of energy, kinetic energy. That's like a wrecking ball, a missile, a bomb that blows stuff apart. Those would have a seismic signal. They'd also launch chunks at a very fast rate that would slam into adjacent buildings. None of the adjacent buildings look machine gun fired. Also, the debris would have to go somewhere if you blew up the building. The ground shook with a surface wave for 8 seconds, but it would take 9.5 seconds to drop a bowling ball off the roof to the ground. That's another piece of evidence that says that building didn't slam to the ground. So kinetic energy it can be eliminated as a destructive mechanism. We're not talking about the device. We're talking about the mechanism of destruction. You have to first look at the mechanism, the failure mode, so to speak. And let's look at thermal energy, where the building's cooked to death. If they're cooked to death, well, you would have seen some, bright, blinding light if it was high heat. You wouldn't see unburned paper flying all over the place.
No, you would not.
When the dust cloud rolled down the streets, people were trying to outrun it, but they couldn't, and then it just mowed over them and kept on going. It just left them covered with dust. They may have had trouble breathing, but they weren't cooked.
Judy, when we come back, I want you to explain how a directed free energy device or technology works and where they may have been situated if those buildings came down that way. I'm George Norrie, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, and of course Dr. Judy Wood, as we talk about her conclusions about the towers and 9/11. Judy, explain how this directed free energy technology works, if you would, where the devices would have to be. Just put it in perspective for us.
Well, again, as I was saying, you first must determine what happened, and you look at all the evidence, and then you determine what the destructive mechanism was. And you can't solve the problem unless you have enough evidence. So jumping to the answer and coming up with a theory and speculation and so forth is solving an imaginary problem. You have to be very disciplined. I know it's tough. And the average person, especially in our current educational system, is not geared to doing that. They're geared to jumping to the answer of a multiple choice test. What happens if the correct answer is not one of the choices? So if you start with this very methodical way of going about it, and you can determine as much as you can determine according to the evidence. And what the evidence shows is that you can eliminate kinetic energy as the destructive mechanism. I'm not talking about Acme Model XXX from aisle 17 of the Acme weapons store. I'm talking about the destructive mechanism. Kinetic energy means it would mean that buildings were beaten to death, like a gravity collapse, a wrecking ball, or missile, or bomb. Thermal energy would mean the buildings were cooked to death, lots of heat. Those two things, the evidence rules out. But directed energy, as I define it, is energy is instructed to do something differently than it normally does. Instead of the bonding forces of matter being attracted to each other, they're directed to repel each other. It's not like something physically hitting it or cooking it. And so within that, it's a big umbrella of things, but energy is directed somehow to do something differently than it normally does. A lot of people are uncomfortable with that. They want to have a device, an Acme model, whatever.
Yes, and that's how we think. I mean, to me,
right.
Somebody's in another building up on top of the roof, aiming this huge pulse machine at all the World Trade Center buildings and firing away. You're saying, hey, didn't happen like that.
Well, we don't have enough evidence to say that's what happened. But from what the evidence shows, we can define that, and then we can look at parallel evidence that produces the same thing.
Well, let me ask you this, though, Judy, because I want to get a better understanding for this. What you're saying that some kind of directed technology took down the buildings, correct? Yes,
and energy was directed in some way.
Now, could it have been within the building?
Sure, it could have been anywhere.
Okay.
Wait, I'm going to be careful because, the detractors will say, she said it was within the building. No, it can't.
No, we're just looking at possibilities. Could it have been from a satellite?
It could have been from a variety of places, but here's an example to maybe help you let go of needing to know exactly where it is. Do you have a cell phone? Mm-hmm. Do you know where the tower is that your cell phone connects to?
I have no idea.
Bingo! Bingo! You just know that it works.
I know that it works.
And you're within the range.
That's right.
And your cell phone works, and you're within the range of the tower it connects to. You need those two things to make your phone work. And it might be a similar type thing where it's an interference like that of different energies, where you need different components. But for now, it's, nothing touch. Well, here's one of the pieces of evidence. You have a steel beam flying through the air, and it's dissolving as it flies through the air. It's turning into dust, and it's not hitting anything. That's amazing.
That is amazing. I mean, just like it's like a Star Trek thing. It's just poof, it's gone.
Or it's sort of like an Alka-Seltzer tablet effervescing.
Yeah.
And as I say, if people have trouble understanding that, I ask them to look at the picture, and I say, okay, let's say you're going to impersonate that beam.
Could we say, Judy, that it dissolves away, but at a very rapid clip?
It's sort of, so follow along with me here. If you're going to impersonate this beam, and you're going to cover yourself with dust and jump off the top of the building, somebody on the ground isn't going to see that amount of dust coming off of you. Okay, so you grab a couple of bags of flour and you start heaving that out on the way down. That still isn't going to account for the amount of dust you see coming out of these steel beams. And pretty soon you realize those steel beams have to be turning into dust in order to do what's getting done. And there's also video of a steel beam falling with the dust. Looks like it overtakes it, and that doesn't happen. It's just run out of dust. It's run out of solid. It's turned to dust. And you look at the intersection where it was supposed to land, and there aren't any solid chunks of steel down there.
How big, how much energy would you need if you're going to take down these buildings?
A lot of people like to ask that question. What are the calculations? Well, what are the calculations going to show? That the building's there or that it's gone? Just look. Whatever was needed, there was enough. And in order to make calculations, you have to make assumptions. And remember, when you're making assumptions, you're now solving an imaginary problem, not a real problem. Mm-hmm. So that's why with this unusual problem, the discipline of just staying with what you know that you know, and knowing that is something separate from what you don't know, and not mixing the two or filling it in with speculation and hypotheses and theories and guesswork. But we can establish what we do know, that, kinetic energy, the building wasn't beaten to death. Thermal energy, rule that out, wasn't cooked to death. And one of the easiest examples or piece of evidence of that is the people at the bottom of stairwell B in Tower 1. The cover image on my book that looks like, I call it the bubbler.
Yeah.
In the Midwest they call drinking fountains, that are constantly going, a bubbler. That's what that looks like. And would you believe, when that picture was taken, there were people in stairwell B, right at the base of that. And they weren't squashed, they weren't beaten to death, they weren't cooked to death. And they thought they were buried under a huge pile of building, and they thought there's no way they're going to get out by the time they could excavate to them. They thought they had 106 stories on top of them. But it turns out that the dust had gone up and blocked out 100% of the sunlight. That's why it was dark. But when the dust cleared, they looked up and saw blue sky.
Now, tell me this, though, Judy. Tell me this. If this is all correct, and some kind of directed energy took these all down, how long do you think they would have needed to have been either pulsing at the building or however?
Wait. You're making assumptions. Again, that's dangerous, because then you're off solving an imaginary problem. If you stick with what you know that you know that you know, this is.
All right. Well, what do we know?
What we do know is that the buildings weren't cooked to death and they weren't beaten to death. So that means the destructive mechanism was not kinetic energy or thermal energy. So bombs blowing up are ruled out.
They found thermite, right? Did they not?
No, they didn't find thermite. They found aluminum powder and iron oxide. Those are some of the ingredients used to make thermite. And, the peer-reviewed paper, they call it peer-reviewed, it was pay for publishing thing, I don't disagree with it, that aluminum powder and iron oxide were found. But guess what? You know what the building was made out of?
What?
It was a steel frame building with aluminum cladding.
Jeez, all right.
So if it's turned to dust, what are you going to find in the dust? But, okay, so if let's say they're going to claim that was thermite. What's the destructive mechanism? You know, what in that dust baggie connects to what happened to the buildings? If you can't make that connection, you don't go anywhere. And the part in my book that I talked about, I used instead of thermite, I used chocolate chip cookies. So the buildings were turned to dust. Therefore, the dust would be expected to contain traces of all materials that were in the buildings. Finding traces of chocolate, sugar, and nano wheat flour in the dust would not prove that chocolate chip cookies turned the buildings to dust. It would not prove that these ingredients had been combined as chocolate chip cookies in the buildings, nor would it prove that such cookies were capable of turning building to dust. The same is true for thermite.
Now, there are some people, Judy, who say that planes didn't even hit those buildings. I find that preposterous.
Well, the building mostly turned to dust. Can airplanes turn buildings to dust?
No, but people saw planes hit the buildings.
But did that turn the building to powder in midair?
No, I'm not saying the planes alone may have done it, but I'm saying the planes did hit.
I'm looking at the destructive mechanism. You know, some people say there's fake planes, and some people say there's real planes. Well, fake planes can't turn a building to dust, and neither can real planes. So getting people arguing about planes and no planes or whatever is a distraction away from what happened to the building. And so I'm very focused on what happened to the building. So I don't deal with the planes.
All right, so that's not your area of expertise, basically.
Well, it's you know, I don't also pay attention to what the operator of the technology had for breakfast. It doesn't solve what happened to the buildings. You know, that's a different issue.
There was always talk that Building 7, which apparently wasn't hit by almost with nothing, basically, was pulled. What are we talking about there? Same thing happened?
Yep, same thing. And did you know it wasn't 3 buildings that were destroyed that day? It wasn't 4 buildings that were destroyed that day. It wasn't 5 buildings. It wasn't 6 buildings. It was 7 buildings that were destroyed that day. Building 4 is one that I've become fascinated with at times, where the entire main body of the building went missing. Gone. You know, gone with the wind into powder. I'm not saying, you know, disappeared or vaporized. I'm saying it's not there. You get a lot of powder around. You know, some scraps and stuff. But it has also images right below the ground of where that was. It was punched down a little bit into the first layer below ground, but in the parking garage, a few stories below that, you can't even tell anything happened. The lights are still on. There's maybe dustier than usual. But where did the building go? Building 4. That was kind of a large. It was a 9-story building, but widthwise, it was bigger footprint. But it's gone. Building 3, gone except for a little shoebox that went in. Building 6, someone today wrote me and said it was saying it was like a jack-o'-lantern all carved out in the middle. Building 5 had these cylindrical holes in it. There's, Building 7, it had all this stuff pouring out of it all afternoon for about 7 hours. A lot of material. And then when it went away, it made a 0.6 on the Richter scale. That's like a jackhammer.
Well, it sure is. How much energy, Judy, do you think was needed to destroy these buildings?
It could even be negative energy. If you can understand the mechanism, that's what the beauty of this is. If there's a silver lining in this, it's that this technology was used for destructive purposes, but it doesn't have to be. It could be used for good purposes, for providing free energy to the world. If you have the ability to affect, the nature of matter, instead of having atoms attract each other, they're repelling each other. So if you just give it that instruction, it isn't like you have to put in a whole lot of bombs and a lot of energy that way. It could be the energy comes from the material. And actually, the dust cloud that rolled down the street, first responders that I talked to said it was cooler than ambient temperature. Not only was it not hot, it was cooler. And then it started feeling warm because you know, you put acid on your hands, it feels like it's burning up, but it could be room temperature. There was something in the dust that was eating on their skin, and they just couldn't, like, they're scrubbing off in the shower afterwards and just couldn't get it out. It was interesting.
So what would happen, Judy, I don't want to get morbid here, but if a human being is in that building and gets hit with this directed energy, what happens to the human? Is the human pulverized too?
I want to get away from the idea of, you know, a point-and-shoot laser beam. It's more of a field effect, like the coverage range of your cell phone. You know, it's a zone of effect. But remember the people who left the building early, they've been referred to as jumpers. I don't think they voluntarily jumped. But they somehow found themselves, you know, getting away from something and they ended up out the window. And weird other things were happening in the building. Like one woman called her husband and said, we're going to start down the stairs, and you got, you know, wet T-shirt wrapped around the head, and we'll call you on cell phone when we get to the bottom. And 2 or 3 stories later, she went out the window.
Do you ever get, Dr. Wood, into the who?
No, but I got about as close as I got closer than anybody has in the public domain. That is, I pretty much know who knows, and that's who I try to take to court.
And tell me about that.
These were contractors on the NIST report, National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Right.
And they were mandated by Congress to determine why and how the towers collapsed.
Okay.
They didn't do that. And I wrote a request for correction to NIST saying, you know, the contractors were leading them astray, and you know, we can't sue a government agency, but we can sue contractors for fraud of a government agency. And there's a couple of the contractors, and one in particular, that had the most number of people on the contract, on the NIST report. They are developers and manufacturers of energy weapons.
Aha.
Not only that, they also had, and still have, I believe, contract with the U.S. government to know everything about any weapon of mass destruction that exists or is being developed anywhere. So not only do they know what technology it is, but they know whose technology it is. Wouldn't it have been nice to have them under oath?
What happened to the suit?
Let's see, the lower court judge dismissed it, saying he wasn't going to hear a case about who shot JFK or what landed on the moon. Excuse me, sir, did you read this isn't about that? Did you get confused as to which?
Yeah, not that case.
So we appeal it, and there's 3 judges in the Court of Appeals. They were very respectful. But see, while working on the case, I couldn't talk about it, and couldn't advertise it, and there was a kind of a clamp down on anybody else talking about it. Not legally, but, you know, those who didn't want this case to go forward were keeping everybody else from knowing about it. But there was only like 5 of us or 6 of us, you know, count them on one hand, who supported this case. Now, if you were those judges, what would you do? And what those judges did, and they're very respectful of me in doing this, they wrote in the written decision, they acknowledged the law applied to this case, but they're ignoring the law and dismissed the case.
Absolutely riveting, Judy. I've got to tell you, as so many people have all their different theories, this one is very frightening.
It's not a theory. It's not a theory. I know what I know that I know.
I know the way you feel about that, but a lot of people believe that. A lot of people do call it a theory, don't they?
Because that's what they're used to doing, is just, you know, what someone says, oh, that's a theory, and is 2 plus 3, you know, equal to 5? Is that a theory?
Shouldn't be.
If I want to know your height, I would start with a tape measure, not a theory. What I'm reporting here is basically that, it's evidence that anyone can observe if they look in my book. I don't tell people what to think.
Let me ask you this, and we're coming up to the break, so I may have to ask you next hour, but why do you not accept the theory or conclusion of Gage in the architects?
Evidence. He presents theories. It is a theory.
Okay, but could you I asked him. I says, how in the heck could you put explosives in these buildings and nobody see it?
Yeah, you go into work one morning and the wall's missing because somebody's putting something in there and somebody doesn't notice. But not only that is, how do you detonate it? Is one of the parts of my book. I showed, just to remind people, I showed pictures of these signs you see at the side of the road saying, blasting zone ahead, turn off cell phones and two-way radios. Okay, how do you do that for Manhattan for 6 months?
Yeah, you can't. Judy, stay with us. We're going to come back in a moment. Dr. Judy Wood, conclusions about where did the towers go, and we'll take your phone calls this hour as well on Coast to Coast AM.